My name is Kai Bird. I'm the executive director of the Leon Levy Center for Biography. This is our 12th, going on 13th year, and we've given out now 44 fellowships, published over 21, maybe 22 books now. It's a very important program. Many of the books are essential reading to understand our world. And they sometimes get prizes. Thus, Ruth Franklin's biography of Shirley Jackson won the prestigious National Book Critics Circle Award for biography. We've also just started, and I want to put in a plug for this program, a new master's program in biography that has just started up this semester, and we've recruited 17 students who are hard at work learning the craft of biography and memoir. And a final announcement, we have our new fellowship recruitment period starting up right now, and the deadline is January 6th. So if you know anyone who is working on a biography or wants to work on a biography, we can subsidize them. I'm delighted to welcome you all this evening to a most unusual program. Instead of having one biographer on stage, tonight we have two. One who has just published his biography of Dr. Oliver Sacks, and the other who has just begun her own long biographical journey. This is Lawrence Wexler's 18th book, I believe. He is a longtime veteran of The New Yorker, a regular contributor to Vanity Fair, the New York Times Magazine, and many other publications. And for many years, he directed the New York Institute for Humanities at NYU. Ren, as he is known to his friends, is a veritable polymath, writing on everything from Poland during the Cold War to art and physics. But for our purposes tonight, you just need to know that he was a close friend of Oliver Sacks over a period of more than 30 years. Laura Snyder is our own very first recipient of the Leon Levy Alfred P. Sloan Fellowship for Science Biography, and she has just started researching a biography of Oliver Sacks. Snyder is the author of 3 previous books, including Eye of the Beholder, Johannes Vermeer, and Tony van Leeuwenhoek, and The Reinvention of Seeing, a winner of the 2016 Sally Hacker Prize for the Society for the History of Technology. She is also the author of The Philosophical Breakfast Club, 4 Remarkable Friends Who Transformed Science and Changed the World. We aim to have a conversation about the peculiar problems associated with writing a biography of a scientist, and along the way explore the extraordinary life of Dr. Oliver Sacks. We'll converse for about 40 minutes and then open it up to questions from the audience. And afterwards, Lawrence Wexler will sign books, courtesy of Books on Call from New York City. Thank you. Okay, Ren. Your book is both a biography, but you call it a biographical memoir.
Yeah.
And of course, you started out, I understand, when you were 29.
Right.
Working on a
Just
profile.
a few weeks ago.
Just a few weeks ago, working on a profile of
Yeah.
Sacks, who was then a completely unknown personality for The New Yorker.
Right.
So then something happened 4 years into it or thereabouts. Why don't you tell that story?
Well, it's indeed the case. One of the things that's quite fascinating and surprising to most of you, many of you will say that you first became aware of Oliver Sacks reading Awakenings. No, you didn't. Nobody read Awakenings. The Awakenings, which is in many ways his masterpiece and certainly one of the greatest books of science writing of the last half of the 20th century, was published in 1973. I won't go into the whole history of
Got no attention at all.
And, well, what happened was it was celebrated by the likes of Auden and Frank Kermode and people like that. It was almost completely dismissed by doctors, by the medical community. It completely failed to follow the rules. It had not been double-blind, control grouped, peer-reviewed, and it was doing case studies, which by that in the mid-century of neurology was really frowned upon. I mean, that was just anecdotal. What value could that be? One of my favorite reviews the book got in England was a neurologist who said, "Sure, if you're going to spend hours and hours with people, you're going to get some interesting stories, but who has time for that?" And indeed, that was kind of the state of neurology in those days. In any case, when I subsequently, 9 years later, in 1982, I interviewed Colin Haycraft, who was his publisher in England. And he said that the first edition, he was the hardback publisher, of 1,500 copies, had not yet sold out.
Whoa.
There had been paperbacks, but none of them had been quite really successful either. So anyway, he was largely unknown. And I had just arrived at the New Yorker. Indeed, at age 29, I had spent the previous 3 or 4 years doing a similar project with Robert Irwin, the artist, the California artist, and I had published a book, or actually I sold it to the New Yorker over the transom. I got very lucky. And I arrived, and I was kind of looking for somebody else who I could have a similar kind of relationship with. I had been corresponding with Oliver. The reason I had read it was because I went to Santa Cruz in the kind of wacky experimental days at Santa Cruz, and my philosophy professor, Maurice Natanson, who looked like God and had the authority of God. As I was graduating, this is 1974, he thrust it in my chest, almost broke my ribs, and said, "Read this." I didn't read it right away, but when I did, I began corresponding with Oliver. This would have been in the late 70s. My first letter basically said, "Although you call the place Mount Carmel, the hospital, it seems much more, your book seems much more Kabbalistic to me, Jewish mystical than Christian mystical."
So what year was this?
This was around 79, 78, something like that. And that turned out to be the right question. 6 months later, I got a letter which began that he had loved my letter, lost it for 6 weeks, found it, written the long reply I'm about to read, lost that for 4 months. But here it is, and basically was indeed, not only is the place is called Beth Abraham, my first cousin is Abba Iban. We are parenthetically both first cousins of Al Cap from Little Abner. I was telling some other people recently, footnote here, that Jules Pfeiffer and Roy Cohn and Dick Morris are all our first cousins.
Whoa, really? Oh, dear.
It's true what they say about those people. Anyway, but in any case, we began corresponding, and when I arrived, I went to see him. I was thinking maybe I could just read a few, just to give a sense of the flavor of the book. Yeah. So I went to see him, and this is what it was like to first encounter him. Let's see here. He was living on City Island at this point. He just moved to City Island, so this is now 1980, 81. And this is, as you know, City Island is kind of this little appendix that comes out of Pelham Bay Park, part of the Bronx. It's a fishing island. And it was this little claptrap house. The house itself, with its rickety front porch and little back garden and its eccentric occupant, reminds me of the pictures I've seen of Joseph Cornell's out on Utopia Parkway. Sachs is a large, robust fellow given to impish, childlike outbursts, his chest proportioned like a squat child, his motions and postures often awkward like a child's as well. When we first meet, I tell him he does not look like I expected. My physical look changes radically over time, he replies. Sometimes I'm bearded, sometimes I'm not. Sometimes I weigh 190 pounds, sometimes I weigh 300. That must be some beard, I hazard. He is currently somewhat closer to the former. He has severe back problems, the result of several accidents, worldly infelicities, as he calls them. And we go to dinner, a brief walk to the nearby fish restaurant. He carries along a narrow, square, curved lumbar support pillow, quote, something of a cross between a prosthesis and a transitional object, he says. At dinner, he suffers recurrent heat flashes, his face reddening and his brow glistening with sweat. And when we return to his home, he heaves himself before the air conditioner in his study. There is one in every room, and basks in its shivery flow, relieved at last. He kneels before the thrumming machine, as if in ecstatic prayer, a contented seal. He tells me he had to get a house for his home. This is his first, in part because of his secret production. This refers to what you're going to be going through. He points to a long shelf parallel to his bed, atop which at least 30 notebooks are neatly arrayed. At most times, I'm either talking, listening, or writing, he says. That's from the last 6 months.
Right, now there are 750
Whoa.
notebooks
I'm sure he,
through now.
and I'm sure he lost several along the way. In other rooms, hundreds of casebooks, notebooks devoted to individual patients whose names appear on the spines, are piled one atop the next. In one room by the study, there's a veritable tile work of audio tape cassettes in their plastic boxes, a wailing wall of contained pain. There are also dozens of videotapes. He's thinking of writing a book to be entitled 5 Seconds, a detailed study of the myriad speeded-up lives that a single ticking Tourette can live through in any random 5 seconds. He needs to use high-speed video equipment in order to even begin to capture it all. He insists every face change or yelp is significant, and that they all relate one to the next. His bookshelves teem with philosophy, Nietzsche, Schopenhauer, Leibniz, Spinoza, Hume, Heidegger, Husserl. He tells me that as a youth he read philosophy uncomprehendingly, but that afterwards he tended to drift away, focusing instead on scientific studies. His patients, he says, coming to him with their philosophical emergencies, forced him back to philosophy. He respects facts, and he has a scientist's passion for precision, but facts, he insists, must be embedded in and tired by stories, and stories, people's stories, are what really have him hooked. And I go on from there, and I could read more, but
So
that gives a sense.
That's the beginning of your relationship.
And so,
And he then, you become close to him, and you begin working for 4 years.
Yeah,
and then
so-
suddenly, I'm going to move this along.
well, this is just to move along quickly. This was a New Yorker project,
Right.
and Mr. Sean had told me that I could do a 3-part, probably 100,000-word piece on
Fabulous.
this guy. At that time,
Those were the days.
largely unknown person. And we went, we went everywhere. We went to London. We went to California. He had stories in both places. He gradually revealed this absolutely astonishing life, which we now know. I mean, his incredible drug use, his bodybuilding, he was the California State heavyweight lifting champion. He was a motorcyclist of extremes, and very gradually began to relate to me what was the blight of his existence, the great, one can almost say the cross he had to bear, which was that he was gay. He had actually acted on it for about 5 years out in California, but had then quit everything, basically cold turkey. At that point, he'd been celibate for 15 years. He would be for 35 years. And a big part of the book is going on rounds with him. I mean, he was church mouse poor in those days. He was mainly working in state institutions and for the Little Sisters of the Poor.
But then
And-
there
and-
came a
and-
point
yeah, and
where
so- and so
he
just-
actually told you
Right.
you had to stop.
Exactly. So,
That must have been devastating.
well, basically, I started writing, or what I did first is I went and I indexed my notes. I myself had compiled dozens of notebooks and so forth, and then I went and I indexed my notes. This is the index to my notes. The index was 250 pages long.
Handwritten.
Yeah, and then I started writing, and I'd say I'd done about 50,000 words, and he, at a certain point, just asked, "Is there any way you can tell the story without mentioning the homosexual stuff?" And he was absolutely insistent that the homosexuality had nothing to do with his science. He would say things like, "I have blocked off that part of
Right.
my life."
Well, this is...
And basically we couldn't. I mean, I said that his homosexuality had nothing to do with his science. His attitude towards his homosexuality had everything to do with his science. That it made him part of the community of the refused, as one of his friends described
so
it.
that's an important point. To
And that
to
there's no- there
establish
was-
that
there
his
was-
personality is actually related to his
Well,
science.
absolutely, of course it is, absolutely.
Laura, do you agree?
Well, I am looking through all these childhood notebooks now, and there's a lot in his high school notebooks around his struggles with his sexuality, which is fascinating to have this viewpoint into. There are pages where he'll say something and then violently cross out what he said, but then save the page somehow, and it's remained in the archive for decades. So I would say this was a struggle. I think I will be looking at the extent to which it had something to do with his science later on. As a biographer, I feel the fact that Sachs came out as a gay man in his autobiography, published at the end of his life, sort of frees me from ethical concerns about, is it my place to
Right.
bring this out?
So neither of you wanted to out him.
I wasn't going to out him. What I did try to say to him was that, Oliver, nobody cares. And he said, "You're as bad as my analyst." I should mention here that he was in analysis 2 to 3 times a week for 50 years with the same man. This is either proof of the failure of analysis or of the triumph of analysis. I'm not sure. That'll be your call, I think. But his analysts used to say that he was the least affected by gay liberation of anybody he'd ever met. He had, by the way, one thing we haven't mentioned is that his mother had absolutely cut into him horribly when she found out when he was about 18, and that was the voice that was the commanding voice in his head, it seems to me, for many years.
But it's extraordinary. He was living in Greenwich Village,
Well,
just a few blocks from.
He was living just a few blocks from Stonewall when Stonewall happened.
And he was oblivious.
Well, he wasn't oblivious. It happened to be that for those of you who did eventually read Awakenings,
Sorry.
that's very funny. You know it's going through your
Just
microphone.
Don't answer it. That's the...
Oh my God. I forgot. I apologize.
Anyway,
but there was this liberation period, but it also
well, that was before.
Right, but it also was a very hard time to come out as gay, wasn't it?
Well, that
if
was,
you were a
yeah,
doctor
no.
and poor and...
So that's definitely the case. And in '69, he was living right near Stonewall, except that he wasn't there because that was the summer of Awakenings. That was the time of tribulation. He was at Beth Abraham 22 hours a day and slept there and so forth, and he just missed it. And he used to say to me, and he said quite poignantly at the end, that I sit in my cell. Now this is many years later. This is 1984. We're having this conversation. I sit in my cell. The door blasted open, but I don't leave. I listen to the dancing and the singing outside the prison walls, but I don't leave.
Wow.
And if there was no way that I could tell the story, and there really wasn't, you couldn't tell his story.
So this reminds me, on this stage about a year ago, we had Edmund Morris and Sylvia Morris. And they did a very funny routine. Both of them have been biographers, and both have written about the living and the dead. And they did a routine where they went back and forth about the advantages or disadvantages of both. And I think they concluded that the dead is better.
Well, maybe for the
living are so-
biographer, not for the subject.
so troublesome. And your story about living with Oliver, trying to write about him, illustrates
was
this, I
just-
guess.
it-
And yet there's enormous advantages to having known him, and your book is so intimate and, as a result.
It also happens that those 4 years, I think, were really hinge years in his life. I haven't mentioned that he, following the failure of Awakenings, in his own mind terms, to get an audience, he had gone to Norway and had a terrible accident walking by himself on a fjord. This was about a year and a half after the book was published, after his mother had died, up in the cliffs above the fjord, where he is attacked by a bull, although his friends are pretty sure it was a cow, and that he fell. He had a terrible leg accident. He had terrible sequels to the leg accident. He could have died, but was rescued by people walking by. He eventually had this operatic experience with his leg, and started to try to write about it, and threw himself into a 10-year writer's block, basically. And the writer's block, by the way, as you will find out,
As I already know.
to your eternal misery, consisted of in graphomania. It wasn't that he couldn't write. He wrote millions and millions and millions of words, just the
Yes.
wrong words.
I am now going through 30,000 pages of draft manuscript of Uncle Tungsten, his first memoir, because I thought it would be really interesting to see what stories were left out of the memoir about his childhood. And I'm finding some really fascinating material in there. But it's a lot of pages.
Well, just admit to everybody that you're not going to look at all the. Don't do it. Do not
I'm
do it.
halfway through the
No.
30,000
Tungsten is one thing. The man who mistook his wife for a hat. Believe me, I have seen so many versions of that. But the point is, it was really a downward spiral. He was writing more and more, and various people, and I was one of them, but also his English editor, were all trying to get him to finish the book. There was this tremendous pressure of very exciting stuff that was building up behind it, but he just wouldn't give it up, and he wouldn't finish it, and he every time he'd do 20,000, he'd do 100,000 words that his friends would get down to 20,000 words, and you just need 500 words right here. And he would come back the day having done 50,000 words, and you'd say, "No, Oliver, that doesn't help us at all," and it just. And the point is, if he had not finished that book, I really think that we would never have heard about him. But luckily, he did. He broke his other leg the next day. His publisher in England sent a telegram saying, "Oliver, you would do anything for a footnote." But luckily, that was done. And within a year, he published The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat, which was a bestseller. And from there, he becomes this other person. But it happens that these 4 years that I was with him the most intensely before he asked me not to do it, I think in retrospect were really kind of hinge years. And then he very quickly becomes the person we know today.
So, Laura, you actually did meet him once in passing, as I understand it.
I met him briefly. In 2012, I was working on a little piece for the Wall Street Journal about upcoming science books, and I knew he had a new book coming out, so I just went on the Barnes & Noble website to see what the date was, to see if it fell into the parameters of the article. And I saw there was a little link to 5 scientific biographies that inspired me by Oliver Sacks. So of course I clicked on it, and I saw Philosophical Breakfast Club on that list, which I had just published the year
lovely.
before, so I was really excited about that. And so like a fan, I went to his website and I sent a contact me message saying, I was very excited to see this, thank you so much, I'm an admirer of your work. And I thought that was the end of that. And then about a month later, I was on sabbatical at the time from my university, working on my next book, and I get a letter with a return address illustrated by a squid, and it was Oliver Sacks, and he had written me a much shorter letter than his first letter to you, but it said how much he enjoyed the book, maybe we could meet after his tour for Hallucinations was over.
And he only took a month to write that letter.
It was
Instead of
probably
6.
very fast, but it took longer for my university to forward the letter to me at home. And then,
You understand, people, this is how it was before email and so forth.
well, there was email then, but he didn't use it.
Right, he certainly
and he
didn't.
wrote in his beautiful fountain pen, this blue-black ink
Right.
that he started using when he was very young in high school. And so for one reason or another, we didn't finally get together until May of 2014. He invited me to his apartment for tea. I showed up. It was adorable. He didn't know who I was because of his face blindness. He couldn't recognize me from my author photo. So I said who I was. And then he stepped back. He showed me he was wearing a T-shirt from the University of Rotterdam in the Netherlands. And he said, I wore this in your honor, because he had seen that I was working on a book on the Dutch Republic in the 17th century. And then he engulfed me in this giant bear hug. And then we spent 2 lovely hours chatting. I was telling him about the new book, Eye of the Beholder, which dealt with a lot of the issues he had dealt with, learning how to see with new optical instruments, because the book was about how artists and scientists were using lenses in a new way to change the way we see the world. And it was hard to use the new optical devices, and there needed to be a new theory of vision. How does the eye work? And of course, that was very interesting to Oliver Sacks. So we had a lovely meeting. We said we would meet again. We said goodbye. And then 8 months later, he announced that his cancer had become fatal and come back. He did provide a very generous blurb for Eye of the Beholder, which was kind of him. But so I feel now, sort of unexpectedly, finding myself in the position of writing his biography, that it was wonderful to have that brief meeting with him, because I have a sense of what he was like in the world, what he was like to talk to, how he filled up space, the twinkle in his eye, the tone of his voice, his kindness. But yet, it was only 2 hours. It was a very glancing relationship, not at all like your friendship with him.
Well, it sounds
gives
like you
me a-
fell in love.
Well, he did have that twinkle in the eye. I think everyone fell in love with him a little bit, male and female. But I think having the distance from him as well, not being so close, gives a perspective that helps in the kind of book I'll be writing, a kind of more dispassionate account without my own emotional involvement.
Yeah, you didn't know him at all like
No,
this.
of course
So what's
not.
interesting in terms of the timeline there is that he basically said, can't we just stay friends, back in 1984. It was kind of a stunning thing to have 4 years of work. It's like, but we did, and he became the godfather of my daughter, Sarah, and remained a very important person in our lives for years and years. And then, for various, a long story about why, but a few months after talking to you, after he had discovered that he was dying, about 3 months before he died, he basically, for various reasons, had seen some stuff, and he said, okay, now write the book. So that is, 30 years later, basically. And my joke about it is it was like having an aircraft carrier going 100 miles an hour and being told to stop on a dime, and then 30 years later being told, go back in that thing and start it up again. That'll,
So then you had to go back to all your old
I
notes.
literally had all the stuff up in the attic.
Luckily, you saved it.
Well, and I did. And the first thing I did is I indexed my notes.
all over again.
It's really weird. I knew about that, but the way I work is, and it is still done in handwriting. The major difference you'll see between the two is that that's really good handwriting. This is a disaster. You can hardly read it, and it ends up being about the same size and so forth. But the thing that had happened, and this kind of comes back to your first question, is that it was never going to be a biography. It was going to be a New Yorker, a midlife profile, which is something different than a biography. But that's the index for a New Yorker profile. This is the index for a memoir.
I see.
And so that I, for example, I'm still going through all the interviews I did back then, and it's lucky because most of those people have died, Eric Korn and Tom Gunn and Bob Broadman and these people who are really important to him. but I have these tapes and the interviews, and so I was going through them and all this stuff, but it was in a different key. I mean, a different kind of register. And for example, I would see things that I didn't at all look at when I first saw them. But I tell at one point he says that he was. This is maybe 1982 or so. He says, I'm regularly falling in love with straight men, the godfather of whose child I become.
Oh, you didn't pick up on that initially?
Well, no, I mean, I obviously, there's all kinds of stuff that was going on all the way through those 4 years. He was saying things. I've just been reading a book which is a tissue of anecdote. I hate it, you know. And he was doing all this stuff, you know, putting his thumb on the scales about how I was supposed to write this book, and I was aware of those, but there were things I wasn't. And in a sense, in the way you read this now, there is, and I would say another thing, that he eventually writes he does fall in love finally, and he does, after the first version of the eye cancer he had and the brush with death, he finally, after 35 years, lets himself fall in love with a wonderful person, Billy Hayes, and has a wonderful last 7 years. But it's interesting, by the way, even 3 years into that, I was putting together a festival for his 80th birthday, five days of all kinds of programming around Oliver Sacks. And he said, I'm not going to come to any of it. And I had, you know, panels on swimming, on bodybuilding, on the deaf, on Tourette's, on Parkinson's, on ferns, on stereoscopy. We had all kinds of amazing panels. And I told him, and he had been living with Billy for 3 years at this point. Publicly, although not announcing it, but he wasn't hiding it. And I said, and I've already contacted all these fantastic poets. We're going to do an evening of the poetry of your two favorite poets, Tom Gunn and W.H. Auden. He said, absolutely not. I said, what do you mean, absolutely not? He said, you know what that's code
yes.
for. And I said, English poets who lived in the United States and have died? I mean, he says, no. And that 3 years into living with Billy, he still could not stand that thing. But what was interesting, he did come to all of the events, basically, almost all of them. And then the next day, pretty much started working on his own autobiography. But what I was going to say is that his autobiography is really thanks to Billy and thanks to, you know, it's written from a position of serenity. Whereas the way he had told me the same stories 30 years later was massively, you know, operatically neurotic. I mean, it was.
So maybe he had to write it to process it.
It might have been partly that. But I also think that he had finally come to terms with things.
So speaking of Auden, I was struck by something you quoted where you have Auden urging Oliver to write up his patient stories and urging him to, quote, go beyond the clinical, be metaphorical, be mythical, be whatever you need. I mean, it's a great description of actually what Oliver then did.
And it was what Luria, his great hero, was already doing, and part of why he was drawn to Auden.
This raises a question which Laura's going to have to deal with in her biography down the road, but how do Sacks's stories differ from the standards of a biographer?
One other thing I want to say about Auden before I answer that, the first
About Auden.
About Auden,
Yeah.
the first galleys, the printed galleys of Auden, the first copy he got, he immediately sent to Auden, who was the first reader of Awakenings. And Auden, this was late Auden. Thank you, Fogg Auden. This is the man who was the master of adjectives. And his letter back said, I want to thank you for sending me this delightful book, which is the most uncanny description of Awakenings, which is harrowing, which is devastating, which is any number of things, but is also delightful.
But, and one thing I would like to add about that question is, one thing I didn't realize just reading, say, Uncle Tungsten, his memoir of his childhood, where he talks about his love of chemistry and how that kind of saved him in a way in a very difficult period of his early life, was how self-conscious Sachs always was as a literary figure or a literary figure to be. Because looking through his notebooks from high school, where he really should have been taking better notes on organic chemistry because he was not getting good grades in organic chemistry, but he would just stop in the middle of taking notes and write stories constantly, these science fiction stories a la Jules Verne, including one that was fabulous. It was about a murderous giant blue crab with mesmerizing eyes, and mesmerized this explorer to death. But then he would write these stories and very self-consciously, as I said, write down who his influences were in writing that story, what story he had read that reminded him, that gave him the idea of the story, what his assessment of the story was, how he thought it could have been better, how long it took him to write. So I feel like at a very early age, he was
already a storyteller.
as a storyteller and a sort of a scientific storyteller.
Well, this is a man whose mother, the first female surgeon in England, an Orthodox Jew, used to always read him as a child, as a young child, her favorite author, D.H. Lawrence.
Well, she also shared with him, Marie Curie's book and her daughter's biography.
I know,
of
but
her mother.
I know, but still, I mean, okay. there's a piece of biography I want to hear about. but
And you will.
Well, and didn't she also invite him to
oh yeah, well, let's not even go there.
dissect a
No,
child's corpse?
she would.
Yeah, that one was strange.
She would, when he was, they knew they had a prodigy, they just didn't know what to do with it, and with him, and she would, early on, when he was 8 years old, she would bring home stillborn fetuses for him to dissect, just because it would be interesting, as one does. But anyway, coming back to your question, though, and I think this is going to be an issue for you, and it certainly was the issue about him, was he reliable as a biographer, quote unquote, or as somebody who did case studies. And I would say I have a whole chapter toward the end of my book devoted to this question, because there is no question that all of his friends, and he himself will say that he was a fabulist, that he was a confabulist, that he was constantly exaggerating in stories about himself, or he doesn't even remember what is right, and and his friends would just say, I don't know, who knows, and so forth, but that he would insist that when it came to science, he was scrupulous, that his science was not infected by that. And I would say a few things about that. I have all kinds of people who agree with him on that, nurses and people who've seen things and so forth. One of the things I say is that he had two different kinds of writing, much in the way that Kapuscinski is a similar figure. Kapuscinski was the great Polish chronicler, but in his day job, he was a journalist, and he filed stories. And then 10 years later, 15 years later, he came back to the same story, and he gave them as if it was around a fire with a snifter of brandy, told you a story, and it's a different kind of telling, and it's conspicuous that's different. And what people need to do with Kapuscinski is look at the original stories, look at how he tells it later on. Oliver similarly had daily, he claimed, and you'll have a better sense of this, that he did 500 words a day on every patient he saw, every time he saw them, and I know he did a lot, and he had binders on patients, not just the Awakenings patients, all kinds of patients, and
you have these 500 words on each patient?
I have probably more.
And
I think there are letters from patients afterwards who have read the stories and who tell him how happy they were. Maybe they disagree with one element.
Those
and
are
then
clinical, scientific.
so those are done. But by the way, they are specifically not the charts, quote unquote, that other neurologists would keep. They're very quite detailed, and then he tells it at another time. So at one level, one needs to look at that. The other point I would make, though, and I'm emphatic about this, is that Oliver used to say he was a clinical ontologist. When we were driving between the Little Sisters, by which he meant somebody for whom the diagnostic question was, how are you? What is it like to be you? That's the reason I have my title. But another way of putting it, especially with these patients who he was so good with, patients who were pickled in remove, who hadn't moved, who were in extremities of crisis and so forth. The community of the refused, as Rodman put it so well. Especially with them, another way of asking the same question was, what's your story?
Right. I liked that a lot in that last chapter when you talked about, narrative as a kind of medicine.
Narrative was the medicine.
And it made me think about, I don't think you drew this explicitly, but it made me think about Freud and how his idea of case studies, forming a story with the patient, or sometimes for the patient, of their experience, he felt would be therapeutic to them. And of course, Freud was a big influence on Sachs and his view
and on
of
Luria also.
Exactly, and on case studies. This idea that you want to
make
story
up the
people
patient
into a kind of humanity and not leave them as the refused.
or as the objects, is to help them find their subjectivity. And these patients who had precisely been being treated, as warehoused, as the previous doctors would come, literally would look at, for a minute, say, yep, that's right, okay, a little bit more saliva today, let's up the ampage on this, so that was the treatment. With Oliver, it was precisely hours and hours of figuring out what the story was. And then, by the way, he would go back and look at other 19th century case studies to check on them. He would do all kinds of stuff to verify. He'd talk to the parents. He'd talk to all kinds of things. But the point was to figure out what the story was, and the story was the therapy.
Right. I think that's why he liked the Philosophical Breakfast Club, because now that I'm learning more about his early life and when he was a child and collecting, herbs on the Hampstead Heath, and then understanding his love of 19th century neurology and psychology, he wanted to be like that. I mean, he saw himself as not a 21st century scientist, but a natural philosopher, someone who wanted to understand the world and understand nature in a more humanistic sense. So as part of a story, as part of art and science together.
At one point, I'm talking to Jonathan Miller, his good friend from his days, all the way back to junior high school, basically. And Jonathan Miller, who was Beyond the Fringe, and then as a doctor and a great opera director and so forth himself. And Jonathan is famous for just being incredibly dark about himself. He's a failure. He's a dud. And Oliver shares a lot of that with him. And I was saying, what is it with you guys? And he said, well, you have to know what we were measuring ourselves against. Mm-hmm. And he gave me the names of 3 people I've never heard of, but who were incredible anatomists from the 19th century. He says, you try those names out on Oliver and see what you get. And Oliver just kind of quailed when I tried those names. And those were the great people,
This is one of the values of this book, is that there are long excerpts of these very detailed interviews of dead sources, people who have now moved on. And of course, Laura is going to be the beneficiary of this.
Yes, absolutely.
So Laura, you have, as I understand it, you have permission to run all over the Oliver Sacks archives.
Yes, I have
And
right now
so
exclusive access
some
to
may
them.
call you the authorized biographer, but you also have full editorial control, I understand. So what are are there any disadvantages to being the authorized biographer?
Well, we've been talking a lot about this in the Center for Biography this year, and we had Ben Moser here a few months ago now, the biographer of Susan Sontag. And I liked how he put it, which was he had a similar arrangement where he had exclusive access to certain parts of the archive that no one else could see, but yet he retained editorial control over the final manuscript, which means no one could say you can't publish this. The Oliver Sacks Foundation, for instance, can say, no, we don't want you to talk about this. And the way Ben Moser put it was, he's the authorized biographer, but his biography is not an authorized biography. So it doesn't have any kind of seal of approval that we like everything in this book by the Susan Sontag people. And I have a similar arrangement with the Oliver Sacks Foundation. They want a warts and all biography. I did not want to write something that was just going to be, a hagiography. And so we actually have a written agreement to that effect. And so as I look through all the material, if I were to find that there's confabulation or making up of things in his stories about patients, I would be talking about that. I will address all the criticisms that have
By the
been
way,
made.
I don't expect that Oliver at any point intentionally confabulates.
I know you don't say that. Some people do.
Yeah.
And I think
And-
it's something that needs to be
Yeah, no,
addressed.
but I do think that he was given to his story being a story as it was happening.
Right, well, in a way, I mean, you sort of say this too, that all narrative,
Yeah.
in a way, is a
Of course it is.
construction.
Of course it is.
Writing your book is a construction.
I
writing
mean,
mine
this is something
a-
that I have dealt with all the time, going back to my New Yorker years and so forth. I mean, if you go away to Bosnia for 3 weeks of reporting and you come back, people don't say, "Open your mouth for 3 weeks and tell us everything that happened." They say what they say is, "Tell us what it was like."
So tell us a
Which
story.
any story.
Tell us a story.
Well,
Right.
yeah, but also any story, every story, and our minds secrete stories the way that our gallbladder secretes bile or
Well,
whatever it secretes.
that's
you know.
why I also don't like the comment or the phrase definitive biography, because I feel like every biographer tells a different story about someone's life. I'm lucky I have access to these archives now, which will later be made available to other writers. I would hope that my biography would be interesting enough and rich enough that other people will want to write more about Oliver Sacks. So I would never want to be thought of as writing the last word. on
Right, I
Oliver
hate
Sacks.
the
That's like
word
another way
definitive.
of burying someone.
There is no
rather
such
than-
thing.
And when in my classes, I used to teach for 25 years. I would teach a class once a year called the fiction of nonfiction, which was about all the fictive elements. It was half the students were graduate journalism students and half were graduate poetry students. I was trying to create generations of lyrical reporters and investigative poets. But and by the way, the other half were PhDs who were trying to remember how to write after having gotten a PhD. But in any case, the point is that I would insist on a first-person voice, not out of megalomania, but out of modesty. Precisely, that this is my best take. You would have had a different take, and this is precisely what's not allowed in most journalism.
So I'm just thinking, to wrap up, one final question. I'm working on a biography of Jimmy Carter, but there are others in progress as I speak now. And over the years, I've done 5 biographies, and I have never once had to ask for permission to use material in an archive. I know you have strong views on that. Do you want to get into that discussion briefly, and then we'll go to the questions from the audience?
I won't go too much into it, except to say that I think it was badly handled, and that the problem of fair use for biographers.
We're talking about fair use of
Material,
quotation.
of quotations.
material,
For
right.
example, I had to ask for permission to use any kind of, it's a long story, but the claim was made by the foundation that everything he'd ever written was the intellectual property of the foundation. There were some things that were okay in my case because I had a special thing, but for example, I had to have permission to use the New York Times essay that he did when he was dying, that he put in. This is an essay that is online. Everybody has access to it, and I was denied access to it. And leaving aside the whole thing, what's been very interesting among biographers is that this has been a huge problem all along. Tried doing a biography of Martin Luther King these days. The Martin Luther King Foundation will not let you use the I Have a Dream speech, In fact, I've just blown it.
It's not just biographers,
Yeah, yeah.
because I do have a PhD, and so I came from academia and scholarship. And even if you have permission to go to an archive and take notes there, you still have to ask for special permission to quote in your published works.
And
for
to which
anything.
I say, by the way, I once did a whole conference on this, a weekend-long conference when I was running the Institute for the Humanities, to which I say bullshit. And what I want to say, what I specifically want to say, is that fair use is and by the way, we had judges there who were telling us this, fair use is a very robust doctrine. And there has now wonderfully been, you can describe what it is exactly, but there's been a best practices for fair use for biographers. And the first sentence in it is that fair use is not a permission you request,
right.
it is a right you assert.
And we've just published this on our Leon Levy website as a statement of best practices for biography.
Unfortunately, publishers are so frightened that they don't do it, and so you continue to get into
We
this
have
thing.
a lot of lawyers in this country.
Well,
So on that note,
it just reminds me of one thing I'll say at the end of this, which is, when we did this great conference, it was the first time that everybody was in the pool together. So we had rap singers, we had academic writers, we had documentary filmmakers, we had biographers, and they were all hitting the same wall. And at one point, Jonathan Lethem gave a talk at the thing in which he gave a talk on plagiarism. The last sentence of which was, every single sentence of this talk has been plagiarized, and he handed out where he got everything from. But then he was on a panel, and he was on a panel with Judge Kaczynski, who has, in the meantime, was the senior judge on the most important circuit, the Ninth Circuit, which is the Disneyland Circuit and so forth. So that was the circuit where these things would generally be fought out. And he was saying, we are dying for these cases. This fair use is a very robust doctrine. But in any case, Jonathan at one point said, I want to point to my wife out of the audience in the third row there. Please, honey, stand up. You can see she's pregnant, 7 months pregnant, and I just want to say that notwithstanding her presence here and our excitement about the coming baby, I say, fuck the heirs. And the point he was making, and it's a point I would make, and I would insist on, is that the heirs who happen to be, contiguous and by the way, I have standing on this because I am the executor of an estate. My grandfather was the composer. The heirs the people who really are heirs to my grandfather, the composer's music, are other composers, other musicians, Jonathan Lethem,
Who are being inspired by his music.
who are part of the chain of creation, and much more so than the heirs. And then in the case of Jonathan Lethem, that he is much more the heir of Philip K. Dick than anybody who got the rights through this kind of thing and so forth. And I feel very passionately about that. It was of no value to me to feel passionate about it, but it's a problem, and I think it has not been sorted out, and it still does need to be sorted out. So I'll say that.
So on that note, we have time for some questions. There are microphones on either end.
Rick does.
I guess not, from that gentleman. Any others?
Please. Great.
Hi. I started out working in movement disorders as a very young woman in the late 70s and met Oliver Sacks at that time. And then I met him a number of times in between and met him also in neuro-ophthalmology as he was ill and dying. And I have a couple of just comments and questions on what you said. One is, I was struck by the fact that you attributed his interest in movement disorders, or the way he described Parkinson patients, because I, too, work with patients who had extreme fluctuations. I did that for years, running a drug study, that his homosexuality influenced it. And there were a number of prominent neurologists here and in Europe who did similar things without a background of homosexuality. The second thing is you said that it would matter to no one that he was a homosexual in this day. And one of my colleagues in neuro-ophthalmology who studied at the yeshiva one day a week walked out in a lecture there where they referred to, I think this is 20 years ago, as homosexuality as an abomination. And the third thing I want to mention is I was struck probably about 30 years ago, more or less, by watching a Channel 13 show in which he was a commentator. I think it was just a brief commentator where he discussed his psychedelic drug experience, which I was astounded because I knew of no other physician that would, practicing that would publicly discuss that. And I thought that was hugely innovative. So those are my.
Yeah, a few quick comments. I have a long footnote at the point where we're coming to the crisis and whether we're going to do it about that. I think coming from California and so forth, I had an easygoing act. It's also worth realizing, by the way, that those 4 years were the beginning of AIDS. It is also worth noting that if Oliver had been as sexual as he was during the 5 years he was in San Francisco and LA, he probably would have been one of the, if he hadn't stopped, he probably would have been one of the people, early people to die of AIDS, or very likely that he could have been. In terms of the drug stuff, I think the drug stuff is extremely important to understand why he and he alone seemed to be able to walk into a room with these awakenings patients who hadn't moved for 30 years, basically, and have the audacity, the harrowing audacity, to think that not only were they different from everybody else, but they were completely alive inside. And he got that from the drug stuff. But my point would be about the homosexuality, that you couldn't write. He was saying, go ahead, you can write. He didn't care about that. He was very happy to talk about that. He was also, parenthetically, he and Eric, his friend Eric, got the first batch of LSD from the Sandoz lab before Timothy Leary, and spent their stone time, injecting it into snails to see whether snails got hallucinations. I asked Eric, did they get hallucinations? Eric said, how can you tell? but anyway, but coming back, my point, anybody who was dealing with anything has had a biography that leads them to a particular way of dealing with it. I would make an argument that Oliver had a preternatural understanding or empathy or something that came out of the secrecy, the inwardness, the stuckedness that his homosexuality. And there was no way I felt that I could write about if I had written just about the drug stuff by itself, it would have just sounded like he was a maniac, And it wasn't just that; it was something much deeper and more profound. And so that's why I say what I say.
This is why it's important to do biographies of scientists, right? To get at the human being behind the scientist.
I think absolutely.
Another question?
Yeah. There's a neuropsychological state that includes hypergraphia, temporal lobe epilepsy. I haven't read everything he's written, but I remember being annoyed when I read, I think it was the 3rd edition of his musicophilia book, that there were way too many footnotes in it. And it really distracted from being able to read it. And I figure, okay, he's famous enough now, no one's editing him. So I have 2 questions. One, did he ever write about hypergraphia and link his own ability? Do we want to call it an ability to write a whole lot, or his inability to edit his work, and link that to temporal lobe epilepsy? Although I guess we have no reason to believe he had epilepsy. That was evident.
He did have
all.
migraines, though.
He did have migraines, but that's not the same.
No,
as
I
far as
understand. I'm
know.
just saying that in terms of.
I've never heard of hypergraphia being linked
But
to migraines. And how did that book get out? Miss Mann mistook his face for his wife. Were there editors involved?
Yeah.
Is that how it worked?
There were always editors. He considered editors to be another blight. He would complain. There's a lot of stuff about him telling stories about and making fun of his own hypographia. I don't think that he would describe it in terms of epilepsy or a kind of epilepsy. I mean, he was that way from being a child and so forth. He did, by the way, have scotoma experiences as a child. He would look up at his mother and not see her face.
Right. I think he was both frustrated and appreciative of editors
Yeah.
because
No,
he knew
absolutely.
he couldn't put out
No,
books
no,
with a
absolutely.
million words.
Yeah, no,
and actually going through draft after draft after draft after draft of Uncle Tungsten, I can see, I mean, the stuff that's left out is very valuable for me as a biographer because I'm just getting sort of the texture of his childhood life, the car his mother drove, books that they owned in their house, people they had over for dinner, things that you wouldn't necessarily want to put in a
Right,
memoir about your childhood, but it's great for me. But I can also see the book becoming streamlined, you know, literary, and a much better book. And I think, and also what I see is Oliver Sacks himself being so critical of his own writing, where he will have a draft, turn it in, you know, to actually his personal editor, Kate Edgar, who's here now and who did so much wonderful work with him, and write in the margins, I think this is very, very weak. You know, this needs to go. And then she would circle things and move things around. So I think he was very frustrated, but I also think he knew his works were much better for it.
I think, by the way, that also is something that comes in those 4 years. He really hated editors in 1980, 84. The whole drama of that stupid leg book. It's a wonderful leg book, but it's a stupid leg book in terms of what it was like to live through it. And it was driving everybody crazy, and he really was angry. I mean, for example, he did this incredible Costa Rica epilogue, which the English editor threw out saying, "No more vegetation!" exclamation point. You know? I can't stand all that vegetation, you know, and I suspect some of those are perfectly lovely essays and so forth. And by the way, a lot of that will show up in Oaxaca and so forth. So I guess what I would say is I don't think that this part of him was in itself a proto-medical epileptic kind of situation. It was just him. And by the way, he did love the footnotes, and he always I always used to see, there was the old joke about Freud's comment about footnotes about the need to display something huge and pendulous down below, you know. But that's not me. That's Freud. Address your complaints, 39 Bergstrasse Street in Vienna. But in any case, he was immensely, wonderfully, maddeningly digressive.
What was annoying to me about those footnotes in the third version of Musicophilia was that he was basically including any letter that had been written to him supporting a small point of one of the phenomena that he was talking about. Can we hear from his editor, if she's in the room?
She's right there.
Her take on
There's
what it was
Kate.
like to work with him?
Go ahead. You have to go to the.
I think you're going to want to speak to the mic. Yeah.
Oliver loved to rethink books all the time. There are many editions of virtually all of his books. He loved footnotes, and we've often joked about publishing the best of his footnotes as a little collection.
Well, his footnotes are fantastic.
Footnotes are fantastic in my humble opinion, and I will speak for many editors in saying that we left out far more than we included. Trust me. We were hoping, he saw the footnotes as almost a sort of hyperlink, if you want, before the internet. And of course, he didn't really understand the internet, but he would have other ideas, or he would want to disagree with himself. Or yes, occasionally he was very excited to find a scientific paper that had been published that supported one of his anecdotal observations. So he felt that was worth including.
Jenny.
Hello. I was very curious to hear Laura say that he really thought of himself more as a natural philosopher than as a scientist. And I wonder if you could expand upon that or, just expand upon that, and because that fascinates me.
Oh, thank you. In the 19th century, before a certain period of time, well, I can date it. In 1833, the word scientist was invented in English. Before that, there was no word scientist. The people who did science were known as men of science, because they were mostly men, or natural philosophers. And partly that lack of a special term indicated the very broad nature of what science was thought to be like at the time, that you didn't specialize in, one very particular type of chemistry or physics, but that you studied the natural world, sort of as a philosopher would, in all of its different elements. And so the formation of the word scientist arose at a meeting of the British Association for the Advancement of Science in 1833, when the poet Coleridge stood up in front of the meeting and demanded that the men attending the meeting come up with a new word, because he felt that natural philosophers was for metaphysicians, sort of armchair philosophers who thought about the way the world was, whereas the members of this association were like mucking around in fossil pits, getting dirty. They were often lower class, not high-born gentlemen. They were making batteries with acid in their basements. And so one of the members of the Philosophical Breakfast Club stood up at that meeting and invented the word scientist in relation to the word artist. So the idea was that art and science were these two elements. But then what happened is there was a parting of the ways, that once there was a term and certain organizations for people who did science, they began to specialize and veer off from artists and literary people. And in my book, Philosophical Breakfast Club, I talk about how the people who helped bring this about would have been and were at the end of their lives sorry about that, because they themselves were natural philosophers. And that's how I think Oliver Sacks saw himself. He was both a scientist who wanted to understand how the mind worked, who wanted to cure patients, a medical scientist, but he was also, from his earliest days, a literary figure, someone who wanted to write stories about how the world was, about what crabs were like. Mm-hmm. Not that he thought they were murderous, but that he could go into such descriptions.
It's an ongoing theme in his life, by the way.
Yes, well, into these very careful scientific descriptions of crabs, but as part of a longer story, a fiction about them. So in that sense, I think he saw himself more as these earlier 19th century figures than the later people who came up after Maxwell, who were more mathematically and physics-driven.
Two notes on that. One is that when he fled England in late 50s, after his mother's horrible malediction and so forth, and just went to California, he very consciously was going to the California of Muir and Burroughs and so forth, and he associated the malediction with Jewishness, he called it Deuteronomical, that his mother had, much as it was the Shiva abomination comment, I wish you had never been born. He saw that as Jewish, and he at one point said to me, I went to California so I could be a Gentile naturalist and not a Jewish neurologist. But I became a Jewish neurologist, but as a neurologist, I remained a naturalist, he said. That's one thing. The second thing I would say is that when I was invited to be the head of the Institute for the Humanities at NYU, I said would do it only on one condition, which was accepted, that we would solve that ridiculous thing and understand that the sciences are one of the crown jewels of the humanities. What's the problem? And I mean, I think that is increasingly, I hope that we are coming to that.
Right, and I feel like Oliver Sacks had a lot to do with bringing this back, the idea that the humanities and science go together, and I think that's one of his important contributions. So not just to neurology, not just to literature, but also to the idea that you can bring together art and science, humanism and science, in a way that now even in the medical profession, more and more people are recognizing this.
By the way, he himself was unbelievably musical. He was catastrophically unvisual. For all his fascination with stereoscopy, he was useless looking at visual things or drawing pictures himself.
Except for photography.
Yeah,
I mean, he had a very good eye.
He had a very good eye.
And
That's true.
That was another way that art
yeah,
and science came together
for him, exactly. I
That
think
even as
that's
a child,
that's
he was sort
absolutely
of
right.
inventing ways to make color
Yeah,
photography.
right. That's absolutely true. But he could not appreciate a painting or draw. I mean, you see in the book there's a picture of him trying to draw a horse, which is just
Well, on that
startling.
note, we've gone way over time, but this has been a fascinating conversation. Thank you very much, Jen.
Thank you. Thank you. That was